Lieutenant Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the corridor, watching as the Valdoran officers strutted past without so much as a glance in her direction. Their crystalline exoskeletons caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the space station, creating rainbow patterns that danced across the polished floor. She had been standing there for 20 minutes waiting for someone to acknowledge the tactical report clutched in her hands. The Galactic Defense Coalition headquarters buzzed with constant activity. Beings from dozens of worlds moved through the corridors with purpose, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and electronic translations. Sarah had grown accustomed to being the only human in most rooms, but she had never quite gotten used to being treated like furniture. Commander Zixithera finally emerged from the strategy room, his forearms gesturing animatedly as he spoke with his aide. The Nexari's blue-scaled head turned toward Sarah for a brief moment, then away again as if she were just another wall fixture. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Commander, I've completed the analysis of the Kethmori supply routes you requested." Zixithera's large black eyes fixed on her with what Sarah had learned to recognize as barely concealed irritation. His translator unit crackled to life with mechanical precision. "Human Chen, place report in standard filing protocol. Analysis review will occur when schedule permits." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had spent 3 days poring over intercepted communications, mapping out the entire enemy supply network. The information was time-sensitive, potentially crucial for the upcoming operation against the Kethmori expansion fleet. But to Zixithera, she was just another low-ranking officer to be dismissed. "Sir, with respect, this intelligence indicates they're planning to move their main supply depot within the next 48 hours. If we act quickly, Human Chen understands order-giving hierarchy, yes?" Zixithera's head tilted in the way that indicated condescension across several species. "Report filing, now." The other officers had stopped their conversations to watch the exchange. Sarah felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her chest, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. She had learned early in her assignment that showing emotion only reinforced their assumptions about human instability and irrationality. "Understood. Sir?" She placed the report in the designated slot and watched as it disappeared into the bureaucratic void. As Zixithera and his entourage moved away, Sarah caught fragments of their conversation through the translator's static. The Nexari word for primitive came through clearly, followed by what sounded like laughter from the others. She had picked up enough of their language during her 2-year assignment to understand most of their casual dismissals. Walking to her quarters, Sarah reflected on how different things had been when she first arrived. Earth had only recently joined the Galactic Defense Coalition, and humans were still viewed as a curiosity rather than equals. They were strong, the other species acknowledged, and surprisingly adaptable. But they lacked the advanced technology of the Valdorans, the telepathic communication abilities of the Nexari, or the mathematical precision of the silicon-based arithmites. What humans did have was pattern recognition, creative problem-solving, and an almost supernatural ability to see connections others missed. But those qualities were harder to quantify on a military efficiency report. Sarah's quarters were small but functional, designed to accommodate the average humanoid form with minor adjustments for different species' needs. She sat at her desk and activated her personal terminal, pulling up the same data she had just submitted through official channels. The screen filled with shipping manifests, communication intercepts, and tactical projections. For the next several hours, she continued her analysis, diving deeper into patterns that the official intelligence brief had only scratched the surface of. The Kethmori weren't just moving their supply depot, they were repositioning for something much larger. The shipping schedules suggested a massive buildup of resources in the Outer Rim territories, far beyond what would be needed for their current offensive. Sarah cross-referenced the data with historical patterns from previous Kethmori campaigns. Her training at the Earth Defense Academy had emphasized historical analysis as a cornerstone of strategic thinking. While other species focused on present-moment tactical superiority, humans had learned to see war as an extended narrative with recurring themes and patterns. What she found made her stomach drop. The Kethmori weren't just planning to move their supply depot. They were preparing for a massive surprise attack on the Coalition's primary manufacturing world of Xerion Prime. The target was 3 systems away from where the Coalition's forces were currently positioned, expecting the enemy to continue their push along the established front lines. Sarah stared at the data, double-checking her calculations. If she was right, the coalition was about to lose its primary source of starship components and advanced weaponry. Worse, the civilian population of Zerion Prime numbered in the billions, mostly non-combatant families of coalition personnel. She tried accessing the official communication channels to alert the command staff, but her security clearance wasn't high enough. The Human Liaison Office had closed hours ago and wouldn't reopen until the next shift. By then, according to her projections, the Kethmori fleet would already be moving into position. Sarah sat back in her chair, staring at the evidence that could save millions of lives. She had stumbled onto the intelligence coup of the decade, and there was absolutely no way to get anyone to listen to her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had joined the coalition to prove that humanity belonged among the stars. But she couldn't even get a superior officer to read her reports. Outside her small window, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the struggles of the tiny creatures who had learned to travel between them. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. If the official channels wouldn't work, she would find another way. Sarah spent the next 6 hours crafting the most comprehensive intelligence brief of her career. She organized the data into clear, undeniable patterns, highlighted the critical timeline, and included projected casualty figures that made her hands shake as she typed them. When she finished, the document was 47 pages of detailed analysis that painted a terrifying picture of the coming attack on Zerion Prime. At 0630 hours, she stood outside Commander Zixthara's office waiting for his arrival. The corridor was nearly empty, most personnel still following the standard duty rotation. Sarah had barely slept, surviving on stimulants and determination. Her uniform was crisp, her bearing professional, but her eyes carried the weight of terrible knowledge. When Zixthara emerged from the transport pod, he was accompanied by Admiral Korthmag, the Valderan sector commander. The Admiral's towering frame made even the large Nexari look small by comparison. His crystalline carapace had been polished to a mirror shine, each facet reflecting the overhead lights like a living prism. Sarah stepped forward, her comprehensive report in hand. "Commander Admiral, I need to brief you on critical intelligence regarding Human Chen." Zixthara's voice carried a sharp edge of annoyance. "Duty schedule not yet commenced. Official briefing time is 0900 hours. Sir, this cannot wait. The Kethmori are planning a surprise attack on Zerion Prime. They'll be in position to strike within 18 hours. Sarah's voice remained steady despite the racing of her heart, Admiral. Korthmag's compound eyes focused on her with the intensity of a targeting system. When Valderan spoke, their voices resonated through chambers in their crystalline structure, creating harmonics that most species found beautiful. To human ears, it often sounded like wind chimes in a storm. Presumptuous behavior from junior officer, the Admiral's translator rendered in clipped tones. Chain of command exists for purpose. Human emotional tendencies cloud judgment. Sarah felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time she couldn't let it stop her. "Admiral, I understand protocol, but the evidence is overwhelming. The Kethmori shipping schedules, the communication patterns, the resource allocation, it all points to evidence?" Zixthara interrupted. "Human Chen submitted supply route analysis only. No authorization for strategic intelligence interpretation." The Admiral's head tilted in what Sarah had learned was the Valdoran equivalent of a condescending smile. Humans see patterns where none exist. Primitive neural architecture seeks connections in random data. Known psychological flaw. Sarah's hands tightened on her report. She had anticipated this response, but living through it was different from imagining it. "Sir, if you would just look at the data." "Assessment unnecessary," Admiral Korthmag declared. "Current intelligence indicates Kethmori continue established offensive along Meridian Front. Resources allocated accordingly. Human Chen will return to assigned duties." Both superior officers moved past her into Zixthara's office. Sarah heard the door seal with a soft hiss, cutting off her last chance to present her findings through official channels. She stood in the empty corridor, holding intelligence that could save billions of lives, and no one would listen to her because she was human. The next several hours passed in a blur of frustration. Sarah tried every avenue she could think of. She attempted to schedule meetings with other commanders, but her requests were denied due to insufficient clearance levels. She tried accessing the emergency communication protocols, but those required authorization from a senior officer. She even considered contacting the Human Liaison Office directly, but they were attending a diplomatic function on the other side of the station. During her regular shift duties, Sarah monitored the communication channels, hoping for any sign that someone else had noticed the Kethmori buildup. Instead, she watched as coalition forces continued their standard deployment pattern, moving further away from Xerion Prime with each passing hour. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a routine data maintenance task, Sarah discovered that her security clearance allowed her to access the station's emergency broadcast system, not to send messages, but to perform technical diagnostics on the equipment. It was a loophole that existed because someone had classified the diagnostic functions as maintenance, rather than communications. Sarah's heart raced as she realized what this meant. She couldn't send an official intelligence brief, but she could run a diagnostic test that happened to include data packets. If she was clever about how she formatted the information, she might be able to get her analysis into the hands of someone who could act on it. Working carefully, Sarah embedded her intelligence report within what appeared to be routine system maintenance data. She tagged it with emergency priority codes and routed it to every senior officer's personal terminal as part of a security diagnostic. If anyone bothered to look beyond the technical headers, they would find her complete analysis of the Kethmori attack plan. As she initiated the transmission, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She was almost certainly violating several regulations by using emergency systems for unauthorized communications. If her analysis proved wrong, her career in the coalition would be over. But if she was right and did nothing, millions would die while she followed proper procedure. The diagnostic completed successfully, showing green status lights across all communication channels. Sarah's report was now sitting in the personal files of every senior officer on the station, disguised as maintenance data. Whether anyone would discover it in time was another question entirely. Sarah returned to her quarters, exhausted but unable to rest. She had done everything she could within the bounds of her authority. Now she could only wait and hope that someone, somewhere, would look beyond the technical formatting and see the truth hidden in the data. Outside her window, the stars continued their eternal dance, unaware that the fate of entire worlds might depend on whether a junior human officer had been clever enough to outsmart the bureaucracy that was determined to ignore her. 12 hours later, Sarah's worst fears began to materialize. She was monitoring long-range sensor data during her night shift when the first anomalous readings appeared. Deep space scanners were detecting massive gravitational distortions in the outer system, the telltale signature of a large fleet dropping out of hyperspace. The duty officer, a young arithmite named Calculator Prime 7, processed the data with typical silicon-based precision. His mechanical voice echoed through the nearly empty command center as he reported the findings. Sensor contact designated Anomaly 779. Mass displacement consistent with approximately 200 vessels. Distance 4.7 light hours. Vector suggests trajectory toward inner system. Sarah's blood ran cold. Her analysis had predicted the attack fleet would consist of exactly 193 ships, based on the supply manifests she had intercepted. The actual count was close enough to confirm her worst fears. She moved to the communication station, her fingers dancing across the interface as she tried to access emergency channels. Her security clearance still wasn't high enough for direct military communications, but she could monitor the responses from senior officers. For 20 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The Standard Night Watch continued their routine duties while an enemy fleet moved steadily toward Xerion Prime. Sarah watched the gravitational readings update every few minutes, confirming that the unknown ships were maintaining attack formation and speed. Finally, Commander Zixathara's voice crackled over the command frequency. Sarah's translator picked up his response to Calculator Prime 7's report. Probable merchant convoy running dark to avoid patrol routes. Standard procedure for civilian traffic in contested space. Sarah stared at the display in disbelief. Even with the evidence literally appearing on their sensors, the Nexari commander was dismissing the threat. She pulled up her original intelligence report, comparing the predicted fleet composition with the actual sensor readings. Every detail matched perfectly, from the number of ships to their approach vector. Unable to remain silent, Sarah activated her station's communication system. Commander, the sensor readings match predicted Kethmori attack fleet parameters. Recommend immediate alert status. The command center fell silent. Calculator Prime 7's optical sensors focused on Sarah with mechanical precision, while the few other duty officers turned to stare at the human who had just contradicted a senior commander. Zix Thara's response came through with icy formality. Human Chen lacks authority for tactical assessment. Return to assigned monitoring duties. No further communications unless directly addressed. Sarah bit back her response, forcing herself to remain professional. But as she watched the sensor readings continue to update, showing the fleet moving closer to Zarian Prime with each passing minute, she made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She quietly activated her personal communicator and sent an encrypted message to Lieutenant Commander Torres, the senior human officer currently serving with the 3rd Fleet. Torres was positioned near the Meridian front, too far away to provide immediate assistance, but he had the authority to contact Coalition Command directly. The message was brief and urgent. Kethmori attack fleet confirmed approaching Zarian Prime. 200 ships, ETA 16 hours. Request immediate verification and response authorization. While waiting for Torres to respond, Sarah began her own unauthorized preparation. She accessed the station's tactical database, pulling up detailed schematics of Zarian Prime's defensive systems. The manufacturing world was heavily defended, but its shields and weapons were designed to repel raiders, not a coordinated assault by a full battle fleet. The numbers were sobering. Zarian Prime's defensive platforms could potentially handle 50 attacking ships, maybe 75, if they had advance warning to coordinate their fire. Against 200 Kethmori vessels, the planet's defenses would be overwhelmed within hours. Sarah's communicator chimed softly. Torres had responded, "Unable to confirm your intelligence through standard channels. Recommend submitting report through proper chain of command. Cannot authorize unauthorized tactical actions." Another dead end. Sarah stared at the message, feeling the weight of bureaucratic procedure crushing down on her. Even the senior human officer couldn't act without proper authorization. And that authorization would have to come from the same commanders who had already dismissed her analysis twice. Calculator Prime 7's mechanical voice cut through her frustration. Gravitational anomaly has altered course. New trajectory indicates direct approach to Zarian Prime orbital space. Sarah's heart stopped. The enemy fleet was no longer maintaining the indirect approach that might be mistaken for civilian traffic. They were moving directly toward their target, abandoning any pretense of being anything other than an attack force. She watched Zix Thara process this information with growing desperation. Surely now the commander would recognize the threat and issue an alert. The enemy fleet was behaving exactly as Sarah had predicted, following precisely the pattern she had outlined in her analysis. But when Zix Thara's response came, it shattered her last hope for official action. Fleet movement confirms commercial nature. Direct route suggests scheduled delivery to Zarian Prime manufacturing facilities. Standard merchant behavior when running behind schedule. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the universe tilt around her. Even with enemy ships bearing down on their most important manufacturing world, the Coalition command structure was so rigid, so convinced of their superior alien judgment, that they couldn't see the obvious truth. She opened her personal files and began composing what might be her final intelligence report. This time she included everything, not just the tactical analysis, but detailed recommendations for emergency evacuation procedures, defensive positioning for coalition ships in the area, and contingency plans for protecting civilian populations. When she finished, Sarah attached the report to the station's emergency beacon system. If activated, the beacon would broadcast her analysis to every coalition vessel within 50 light years. Of course, activating an emergency beacon without authorization was a court-martial offense. Sarah stared at the activation switch, knowing that pressing it would end her military career but might save millions of lives. Outside the station's viewports, stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the human struggling with an impossible choice between duty to protocol and duty to conscience. The gravitational sensors updated again. The enemy fleet was now less than 12 hours from Zarian Prime and still accelerating. Sarah's hand hovered over the emergency beacon activation switch for what felt like an eternity. The weight of potential consequences pressed down on her. Court-martial, imprisonment, exile from the coalition she had worked so hard to serve. But the alternative was unthinkable. Millions of civilians dying while she followed protocol. She pressed the switch. Immediately, alarms began screaming throughout the station. Emergency lights bathed the command center in pulsing red as automated systems began broadcasting Sarah's intelligence analysis across all coalition frequencies. Her voice, pre-recorded as part of the emergency protocol, echoed through the corridors. All coalition vessels, this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen aboard Defense Station Omega-7. Emergency intelligence indicates massive Kethmori attack fleet approaching Zarian Prime. Estimated fleet strength 200 vessels, arrival in 11 hours. Recommend immediate evacuation of civilian populations and deployment of all available defensive assets. The command center erupted into chaos. Calculator Prime 7's optical sensors swiveled frantically between multiple displays as he tried to process the sudden flood of incoming communications. Duty officers scrambled to their stations, training taking over despite their confusion about what was happening. Commander Zixithara burst through the command center doors, his forearms gesticulating wildly as he shouted orders in his native language. His translator struggled to keep up with the rapid-fire Nexari speech, producing fragments like unauthorized activation and immediate arrest. Human Chen. Explain emergency beacon activation immediately. Zixithara's black eyes fixed on Sarah with fury that transcended species barriers. Sarah stood at attention, her decision made and her conscience clear. Sir, enemy fleet confirmed approaching Zarian Prime. Emergency protocols required immediate warning to coalition forces. No enemy fleet confirmed. Sensor readings indicate civilian traffic. Zixithara's voice rose to a pitch that made the translator emit electronic squeaks of protest. Human Chen under arrest for violation of emergency procedures. But before the Nexari commander could summon security, Calculator Prime 7's mechanical voice cut through the argument with devastating precision. Commander, receiving confirmation signals from multiple coalition vessels. Fleet Admiral Vorthak acknowledging emergency beacon. Admiral requests immediate strategic briefing. The command center fell silent except for the continuing wail of emergency sirens. Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with terror. Fleet Admiral Vorthak was the supreme commander of coalition forces in this sector, a Valdoran whose tactical genius was legendary across known space. If he was responding personally to her emergency beacon, it meant the threat was being taken seriously at the highest levels. Zixithara's head tilted in the gesture Sarah had learned, indicated extreme confusion. Admiral Vorthak requesting briefing? On civilian merchant convoy? Sir, Calculator Prime 7 replied with mechanical honesty. Admiral specifically referenced Kethmori attack fleet analysis provided by Lieutenant Chen, requests full tactical assessment, and defensive recommendations. Sarah watched. Zixithara processed this information, his translator humming quietly as he struggled to reconcile his dismissal of her analysis with the fleet admiral's obvious concern. Finally, his black eyes fixed on her again, but this time with uncertainty rather than anger. Human Chen will provide briefing to Admiral Vorthak, under supervision. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of activity that Sarah could barely process. Her small workstation became the center of a growing crowd of senior officers, as her intelligence analysis was transmitted to Coalition Command. Admiral Vorthak himself appeared on the main display, his crystalline features reflecting the command center's emergency lighting. Lieutenant Chen, the Admiral's harmonic voice filled the room through high-quality speakers. Your analysis indicates significant threat to Zarian Prime. Provide detailed assessment of enemy capabilities and intentions. Sarah stood before the massive display, acutely aware that dozens of senior officers were watching her every word. Many of them had dismissed her just hours before, but now they hung on every detail as she explained the patterns she had discovered in the intercepted communications. The Kethmori supply manifest indicate a buildup of specialized boarding equipment and siege weapons, Sarah explained, highlighting relevant data on the tactical display. This suggests they intend to capture Zarian Prime's manufacturing facilities intact, rather than destroying them from orbit. Admiral Vorthak's compound eyes focused intently on the data. Probability assessment for successful planetary defense? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing her answer could influence the fate of billions. Without advance warning and proper defensive positioning, Zarian Prime's defenses would be overwhelmed within 6 hours. With the information we now have, and proper deployment of available coalition assets, we can extend that to approximately 18 hours. Enough time for reinforcements to arrive. Unacceptable odds, the Admiral declared, initiating emergency evacuation protocols for civilian populations. All available vessels will proceed immediately to Xerion Prime defensive positions. The command center exploded into activity as orders went out across the coalition fleet. Sarah watched in amazement as her analysis, dismissed just hours earlier as human paranoia, became the foundation for the largest emergency military deployment in recent coalition history. But even as ships began changing course throughout the sector, Sarah realized that the real battle was just beginning. The Keth Mori attack fleet was still approaching Xerion Prime, and despite the coalition's response, they would arrive hours before most reinforcements could reach the system. Commander Zix Thera approached her workstation, his earlier hostility replaced by professional curiosity. Human Chen tactical recommendations for immediate defensive deployment. Sarah pulled up the stellar cartography data, highlighting coalition vessel positions throughout the sector. The patrol ships currently near Xerion Prime need to establish a defensive perimeter outside the orbital manufacturing platforms. If they can delay the Keth Mori advance for even 2 hours, the second battle group will arrive from the Chronos system. Patrol ships insufficient for delaying action against full battle fleet, Zix Thera observed. Sarah nodded grimly. They'll take heavy casualties. But if they can force the Keth Mori to break formation and engage piecemeal, it might buy enough time. What she didn't say, but what everyone in the command center understood, was that the patrol ships would be facing a suicide mission. The small vessels were designed for reconnaissance and piracy suppression, not fleet engagement. Their crews would be volunteering to die to protect Xerion Prime's civilian population. Admiral Vorthak's voice filled the command center again. Lieutenant Chen, your analysis has potentially saved millions of lives. Coalition Command is implementing your recommendations immediately. You will remain on communication with Tactical Command to provide ongoing intelligence assessments. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and terror as she realized the full weight of responsibility now resting on her shoulders. Her unauthorized emergency beacon had set massive military machinery in motion, but the outcome was still far from certain. In less than 10 hours, the largest space battle in recent coalition history would begin, based entirely on intelligence analysis that every senior officer had initially dismissed as human paranoia. 8 hours later, the first engagement began exactly as Sarah had predicted. The Keth Mori fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Xerion system, their massive dreadnoughts emerging from the void like predators emerging from tall grass. Sarah watched the tactical display with growing dread as sensor readings confirmed her worst estimates. 206 enemy vessels, including 12 capital ships large enough to crack planetary shields. The coalition patrol force waiting to meet them consisted of 18 frigates and 6 destroyers, commanded by Captain Mira Vasquez aboard the destroyer CNS Defiant. Sarah had worked with Vasquez before during training exercises, and she knew the human captain understood exactly what she was being asked to do. Patrol Force 7 to Defense Station Omega 7. Vasquez's voice crackled across the communication system, confirming enemy fleet disposition. Request tactical guidance for engagement. Sarah looked around the command center, realizing that all eyes were now on her. Admiral Vorthak had designated her as the primary tactical coordinator for the defense, effectively placing a junior lieutenant in charge of coordinating one of the largest space battles in coalition history. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same officers who had dismissed her analysis were now hanging on her every word. Captain Vasquez, enemy formation suggests they're prioritizing speed over defensive positioning, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Recommend hit-and-run tactics against their flanking elements. Force them to break formation while avoiding direct engagement with capital ships. The tactical display updated in real time as the patrol force moved to intercept. Sarah had spent the last several hours studying Keth Mori tactical doctrine, identifying weaknesses in their traditional battle formations. The enemy favored overwhelming frontal assaults, relying on superior numbers and firepower to crush opposition. But that same doctrine made them vulnerable to fast, coordinated strikes against their exposed flanks. Understood. Control. Beginning attack run on enemy screening force. Sarah watched as tiny blue icons representing coalition ships accelerated toward the much larger red formations of the Keth Mori fleet. The engagement began with a brilliant flash of energy weapons fire as the first wave of frigates strafed the enemy's outer perimeter calculator. Prime 7 provided running commentary with mechanical precision. First engagement wave successful. Enemy screening vessels taking damage. Coalition forces maintaining formation integrity. But Sarah could see the larger picture developing on the tactical display. Even as the patrol force scored hits against the Kethmori flanks, the main enemy battle line continued its steady advance towards Zarian Prime. The massive capital ships barely seemed to notice the frigates harassing their escorts. Captain Vasquez, enemy main force maintaining advance. Recommend targeting their command ship to disrupt coordination. There was a pause before Vasquez responded, and Sarah could hear the strain in the captain's voice. Control enemy command ship is a Fortress-class dreadnought. We don't have the firepower to penetrate its defenses. Sarah studied the enemy formation, looking for alternatives. Her human pattern recognition training kicked in as she noticed something unusual about the Kethmori deployment. Captain, the command ship is maintaining position at the center of their formation, but their communication arrays are exposed above the hull. If you can get close enough to damage those arrays, they'll lose coordination with their battle groups, Vasquez finished. Risky, but it might work. Defiant moving to attack position. The next few minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. She watched as Captain Vasquez led her destroyer on a desperate attack run against the Kethmori flagship, using the massive ship's blind spots to avoid its main weapons. The Defiant's energy cannons focused their fire on the communication arrays protruding from the dreadnought's upper hull. The attack succeeded beyond Sarah's expectations. As the enemy flagship's communication systems went dark, the entire Kethmori formation began to break apart. Without central coordination, individual battle groups started operating independently, making tactical decisions based on limited local information. Excellent work. Patrol Force 7. Admiral Vorthak's voice boomed across the communication channels. Enemy formation integrity compromised. Second battle group arriving in 47 minutes. But Sarah could see that 47 minutes might as well be 47 hours. Even with their coordination disrupted, the Kethmori fleet was still advancing toward Zarian Prime's orbital defenses. The planet's shield generators and defensive platforms were powerful, but they couldn't handle a sustained assault from 200 enemy ships. Admiral, recommend evacuation of remaining civilian population, Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was suggesting. Even with defensive platforms, we can't guarantee planetary protection. Evacuation in progress, Admiral Vorthak replied. But transport capacity insufficient for complete civilian removal. Approximately 4 million non-combatants will remain on planet. Sarah stared at the tactical display, watching as the Kethmori fleet closed the distance to Zarian Prime. 4 million people who couldn't be evacuated in time, depending on a defense that was outnumbered 10-1. The patrol force had performed brilliantly, but they were already taking heavy casualties from their hit-and-run attacks. Then she noticed something in the enemy formation that made her heart race. Admiral, the Kethmori are clustering their capital ships for orbital bombardment positioning. If we could coordinate a concentrated attack... Explain, the Admiral commanded. Sarah's fingers flew across her workstation as she highlighted the enemy deployment pattern. They're grouping their heaviest ships in preparation for siege operations. But that concentration makes them vulnerable to coordinated fire from Zarian Prime's orbital defense platforms. Platform weapons insufficient against capital ship armor, Commander Zixthara observed. Not against their armor, Sarah agreed, but concentrated fire against their engine systems could disable their maneuvering capability. If we can trap even half their capital ships in orbit, they become sitting targets when our reinforcements arrive. Admiral Vorthak's crystalline features reflected the command center's lighting as he considered the proposal. High-risk strategy. Orbital platforms would be exposed to counterattack. Yes, sir, Sarah acknowledged. But if we wait for them to establish siege positions, those platforms will be destroyed anyway. This gives us a chance to take some of them with us. The Admiral was silent for several moments, weighing the desperate mathematics of space combat. Finally, his harmonic voice filled the command center. Approved. Coordinate with Zarian Prime Defense Command. All orbital platforms will focus fire on enemy engine systems. Sarah initiated communication links with the Planetary Defense Force, watching as her desperate plan began to take shape. The next few minutes would determine whether Zarian Prime survived the night and whether her unauthorized emergency beacon had saved millions of lives or merely delayed their deaths by a few hours. The coordinated attack on the Kethmori capital ships began with devastating precision. Sarah watched the tactical display as 43 orbital defense platforms turned their massive energy weapons toward the clustered enemy fleet. The concentrated firepower lit up space around Xerion Prime like an artificial star, streams of coherent energy lancing through the void toward their targets. Direct hits on 7 enemy capital ships. Calculator Prime 7 reported with mechanical satisfaction. Engine systems severely damaged. Enemy vessels losing maneuvering capability. But the Kethmori response was swift and brutal. The trapped capital ships, unable to maneuver, focused all their firepower on the orbital platforms. One by one, the defensive installations began to disappear in brilliant explosions as enemy fire found their mark. Platform 7 destroyed, the mechanical voice continued. Platform 12 taking critical damage. Platform 19 offline. Sarah felt each loss like a physical blow. Every destroyed platform represented hundreds of coalition personnel and reduced their ability to hold the system. But her gamble was working. 7 enemy capital ships were now effectively out of the battle, their mobility crippled and their formations broken. "Admiral, enemy fleet fragmenting," she reported. "Recommend immediate pursuit by available coalition forces while they're disorganized." Captain Vasquez's voice crackled over the communication system. "Control. Patrol Force 7 engaging scattered enemy formations, taking heavy casualties but maintaining pressure." Sarah could hear the exhaustion in Vasquez's voice. The patrol force had been fighting continuously for over an hour, their small ships pushing far beyond normal operational limits. She pulled up damage reports and felt her stomach drop. Of the original 24 patrol vessels, only 11 were still operational. Then Admiral Vorthak's voice cut through the tactical chatter with news that changed everything. Second battle group entering weapons range. Admiral Chentara commanding 47 vessels, including battlecruiser Inexorable. Sarah's heart leaped as she watched new blue icons appear on the tactical display. The second battle group represented the largest concentration of coalition firepower in the sector, led by one of their most experienced commanders. But even as relief flooded through her, she realized the battle was far from over. "Admiral, recommend coordinated attack on remaining enemy capital ships," Sarah said, her tactical mind already calculating optimal engagement patterns. "If we can eliminate their heavy units before they reorganize." "Agreed." "Admiral Chentara, coordinate with Tactical Command for immediate assault on enemy battle line." The next phase of the battle unfolded with clockwork precision as Sarah coordinated between multiple fleet elements. Her human ability to see patterns and connections proved invaluable in managing the complex three-dimensional chess game of space combat. She directed Admiral Chentara's battlecruisers against the heaviest enemy ships while guiding Captain Vasquez's surviving patrol vessels in harassment attacks against enemy formations trying to regroup. But it was what Sarah noticed about the Kethmori retreat pattern that turned the tide completely. As she watched enemy formations pulling back from Xerion Prime, she realized they weren't conducting a fighting withdrawal. They were trying to reach specific coordinates in space. "Admiral, the enemy isn't retreating randomly," she reported with growing excitement. "They're moving toward rally points for hyperspace jump. If we can intercept them before they reach jump coordinates." Admiral Vorthak immediately grasped the implications. "Prevent enemy escape. Pursue and engage all fleeing formations." What followed was less a battle than a systematic destruction of the Kethmori fleet. Cut off from their escape routes and caught between multiple coalition formations, the enemy ships were forced to surrender or be destroyed. Sarah coordinated the pursuit with surgical precision, using her understanding of Kethmori tactics to predict their movements and position coalition forces for maximum effectiveness. By the time the last enemy ship either surrendered or was destroyed, the Kethmori attack fleet had been completely eliminated. Of the 206 ships that had threatened Xerion Prime, only 37 survived to be taken as prisoners. The rest were scattered across the system as debris fields and expanding gas clouds. "Final engagement complete," Calculator Prime 7 announced. "Enemy fleet neutralized. Xerion Prime secure." The command center erupted in cheers from officers representing dozens of species. their various forms of celebration creating a symphony of victory that transcended language barriers. Sarah slumped in her chair, the accumulated tension of the last 24 hours finally catching up with her. Admiral Vorthak's image filled the main display as he addressed the entire command staff. The victory at Xerion Prime represents the largest defeat of Kethmori forces in Coalition history. But this victory was only possible because of exceptional intelligence analysis and tactical coordination provided by Lieutenant Sarah Chen. Sarah felt dozens of eyes focusing on her as the Admiral continued. Lieutenant Chen's unauthorized activation of emergency protocols violated standing orders but saved approximately 4 million civilian lives. Her tactical coordination during the battle prevented the loss of one of our most strategically important worlds. Commander Zix Thara stepped forward, his earlier hostility completely replaced by what Sarah recognized as Nexari respect. Admiral, recommend Lieutenant Chen for immediate commendation and promotion. Recommendation noted, Admiral Vorthak replied. Coalition Command will review Lieutenant Chen's actions for appropriate recognition. As the communication ended and the command center began returning to normal operations, Sarah reflected on the impossible 24 hours she had just lived through. She had gone from being dismissed as a paranoid human to coordinating the defense of an entire star system. The same pattern recognition abilities that other species had mocked as primitive neural architecture had proven to be exactly what the Coalition needed when facing an unprecedented threat. But more importantly, she had proven that sometimes the most important military quality wasn't advanced technology or superior firepower. It was the willingness to look at data with fresh eyes and act on what you saw, even when everyone around you said you were wrong. 3 weeks after the Battle of Xerion Prime, Sarah stood before the largest gathering of Coalition military leadership she had ever seen. The Grand Assembly Hall aboard Coalition Command Station hummed with activity as representatives from every member species filled the massive amphitheater. The crystalline architecture of the station created natural acoustics that carried even whispered conversations throughout the space. Sarah wore her dress uniform, the deep blue fabric crisp and unmarked except for her standard service ribbons. She had been told to expect appropriate recognition for her actions. But the scale of the ceremony suggested something far beyond the routine commendations she had imagined. Fleet Admiral Korthvale, the Supreme Commander of Coalition forces, stood at the central podium. His Valdoran physique towered over the assembled crowd, his crystalline carapace reflecting the ceremonial lighting in brilliant patterns. When he spoke, his harmonic voice filled the amphitheater without need for amplification. The Battle of Xerion Prime will be remembered as a turning point in our conflict with the Kethmori hegemony. But more than that, it represents the triumph of Coalition principles, the idea that diverse perspectives and capabilities make us stronger than the sum of our parts. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a recognition ceremony. It was a public acknowledgement before the entire Coalition leadership of the value of human tactical thinking. Lieutenant Sarah Chen demonstrated that effective military leadership is not determined by species origin, technological advancement, or traditional measures of capability, Admiral Korthvale continued. Through exceptional intelligence analysis, tactical innovation, and personal courage, she prevented what would have been the greatest military disaster in recent Coalition history. The Admiral paused, his compound eyes scanning the assembled crowd. But Lieutenant Chen's actions also highlight a critical failure in our command structure. Her analysis was dismissed not because it lacked merit, but because it came from a species that others considered inferior in military matters. Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as Admiral Korthvale's words echoed through the hall. She could see Commander Zix Thara in the crowd, his Nexari features carrying what she now recognized as genuine respect. Captain Vasquez sat with the other surviving officers from Patrol Force 7, all of whom had been decorated for their heroic actions during the battle. The Coalition Defense Forces exist to protect all member worlds and all member species, the Admiral declared. We cannot fulfill that mission if we allow prejudice and assumption to override tactical reality. Therefore, Coalition Command is implementing immediate reforms to ensure that intelligence analysis and tactical recommendations are evaluated based on merit, not origin. A murmur ran through the crowd as the implications of this announcement became clear. The Admiral was essentially acknowledging that institutional bias had nearly led to catastrophic military failure. and committing to structural changes to prevent it from happening again. Lieutenant Chen, Admiral Korthvale's voice carried across the amphitheater. Please step forward. Sarah walked to the podium on unsteady legs, acutely aware that this moment was being broadcast across the entire coalition. As she approached, two ceremonial guards stepped forward, carrying an ornate case that gleamed with precious metals and exotic materials for exceptional intelligence analysis that prevented the loss of Xerion Prime and saved approximately 4 million civilian lives, the Admiral announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, for tactical innovation under extreme pressure that led to the complete defeat of a numerically superior enemy force, and for personal courage in acting on conviction despite institutional resistance. Lieutenant Sarah Chen is hereby awarded the Coalition Star of Valor. The case opened to reveal a medal unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The central star was crafted from rare tritanium, surrounded by elements representing each member species of the Coalition. Small holographic projectors embedded in the metal created a subtle light display that shifted as the Admiral lifted it from its case. As Admiral Korthvale placed the medal around Sarah's neck, she felt its surprising weight, not just the physical mass of precious materials, but the symbolic weight of recognition from the most powerful military alliance in known space. The Coalition Star of Valor is our highest decoration for tactical excellence, the Admiral explained to the assembled crowd. It has been awarded only 23 times in Coalition history, and never before to a junior officer. The hall erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. Representatives from species Sarah had never even heard of were standing and cheering, their various forms of acclaim creating a cacophony of celebration that transcended cultural boundaries. But it was what happened after the ceremony that meant the most to Sarah. As the crowd began to disperse, senior officers from across the coalition approached her with requests for consultation on tactical matters. Species that had dismissed human military thinking for years were now asking for her analysis of strategic situations. Commander Zixathara was among the first to approach. Lieutenant Chen, Major Chen, he corrected himself, acknowledging her promotion that had been announced along with the medal. Coalition intelligence requests your assessment of Kethmori defensive positions in the Outer Rim territories. Sarah smiled, remembering their first encounter when he had dismissed her supply route analysis without even reading it. I'll have a preliminary report ready within 48 hours, Commander. As she left the ceremony hall, Sarah reflected on how completely her situation had changed. The same analytical abilities that had been dismissed as primitive human pattern-seeking were now valued as innovative tactical thinking. The emergency beacon activation that should have ended her career had instead launched her into the highest levels of coalition military planning. But perhaps most importantly, she had opened a door for other humans serving in the coalition. The reforms Admiral Korthvale had announced would ensure that future human officers wouldn't face the same institutional bias that had nearly prevented her warnings from being heard. Sarah touched the medal, hanging around her neck, feeling its weight as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with energy weapons and starships, but with courage and conviction in the face of those who said you didn't belong. The stars outside the station's massive viewports continued their eternal dance, but for the first time since joining the coalition, Sarah felt like she was truly part of that cosmic ballet, rather than just an observer trying to prove she belonged among the dancers.